Hello everyone, welcome to the Hindu analysis for 15th February 2021. Let us begin with the first article today. Prime Minister hands over Arjuna Mk1A tank to Army. So yesterday Prime Minister Narendra Modi handed over the indigenously developed main battle tank Arjuna Mk1A variant to the Indian Army. The Army will get 118 units of the main battle tank, which is indigenously designed, developed and manufactured by CVRDE and DRDO combinedly. So the Arjuna main battle tank project was initiated by DRDO in 1972, along with Combat Vehicles Research and Development Establishment CVRDE as its lead laboratory. The goal for developing a main battle tank for Indian Army started in the year 1972 itself. For any army, armored divisions play an important role in either offensive action or defensive action. Armored vehicle units such as tanks play a crucial role for establishing dominance over the invading side in a situation of war or defensive positions. So tanks are crucial for any army in strategic deployments or in strategic situations. India has been for long been dependent on Russian-made T-70 tanks to fulfill its armored division needs. Meaning it was entirely, we were importing Russian tanks and we were building Russian tanks on an agreement with Russia, and these tanks, Russian tanks, were fulfilling the main battle tank needs for India. Realizing that we need some more concrete and some more indigenous solutions to meet Indian demands, government at that time came to an agreement with DRDO to set up a special armored vehicle research division, that is CVRDE, to develop tanks and other indigenous armored vehicles to fulfill our needs. So in 1972 we had the idea to develop our own main battle tank concept, and we came out with Arjuna. So Arjuna over the years have went multiple iterations fulfilling the needs of the time. Indian Army had 128 Arjuna first version tanks, then came the Mk2 version tanks. Mk1A is the latest iteration, having more than 50 or 60 upgrades to meet the current demands of Indian Army. Similarly, building on the Arjuna main battle tank concept, we are also building the future main battle tank, futuristic main battle tank, where it will have far more ground sensing sensors and far more futuristic technologies, like more sensory additions and more defensive additions to the tank itself. Coming back to the main battle tank and combat vehicle research development establishment, the objective was to create a state-of-art tank with superior firepower, high mobility and excellent protection. The tanks which we generally use have more than one role to be performed in any situation. Not only they have to be mobile and fire multiple varied range of ammunition to defend our territory, they also have to be protective, meaning whenever somebody fires some missiles or some anti-tank ammunition on us, these tanks must be able to withstand those kind of roughage also. So the objective was to create superior firepower, meaning bigger barrel, bigger saber round battle tanks. The second is high mobility. It should be agile, it should be mobile, and it should be light, all while protecting the occupants, meaning our soldiers who are driving the tanks in it, by way of excellent protection. So over a period of time we came up with multiple iterations of Arjuna tanks. Currently the current iteration is Mk1A tank, which has more than, I repeat, 50 upgrades according to our specific needs. Arjuna is our main battle tank for Indian Army. Coming to the next article, Senate acquits Trump of incitement. So post Capitol riots in United States, the Senate, the Democratic Party initiated, meaning the Democratic senators in the US Congress initiated second impeachment trial on Mr. President, accusing him of inciting riots on Capitol, meaning an insurrection was incited by Mr. Trump. So this impeachment trial went through the entire process for the past 1.5 weeks, and at the end of the day, the Senate acquitted Trump of incitement, meaning the second impeachment trial that has been initiated against Mr. Trump has also failed, meaning he was acquitted of all charges. With this, Mr. Trump's second impeachment trial was shorter than his first, that was initiated in 22. Remember, in 2020 they initiated an impeachment trial based on the accusation that he was in cahoots with Russian government or with Putin, and he was trying to undermine the democracy of United States. That was the first impeachment trial against Mr. Trump, which failed then also because the Republican Party was able to secure enough votes to acquit Mr. Trump of those Russian collusion charges also. Now again, at the end of his term, when the Capitol riots took place in Washington DC at the end of Mr. Trump's administration, before Mr. Biden's inauguration, the Democrats again tried to impeach Mr. Trump on the grounds that he incited violence on US Capitol and he led an insurrection on the government of United States. This trial was very much shorter. The Russian collusion trial went on for months on end. This trial just was for 2.5 weeks or 1.5 weeks short, and at the end of the day, the Democrats tried to prove that Mr. Trump gorged, or he tried to influence a group of people to carry out a violent insurrection on US Capitol. But the Republicans again were using their votes, but had enough votes to counter the allegations made by the Democratic Party, and he was again acquitted, meaning the impeachment trial was a failure. The first impeachment trial was a failure because they couldn't garner enough votes to impeach Mr. Trump. That was in 2020. Again, now at the end of the tenure of Mr. Trump and the beginning of Biden's administration, the Democrats failed to again get enough votes to impeach Mr. Trump, ending the impeachment trial of Mr. Trump for the second time. Now with this statement, he has been acquitted twice. He was the only president to be impeached or tried to be impeached for 2 times. Earlier, only once was enough, and then also it did not succeed. No president was impeached ever in the history of United States, but the highest number of impeachment trials goes to Mr. Trump because he was tried and to be impeached for 2 times. With this, he's in the clear, and from the statements from his party and his aides who support him indicates that he is very much in opinion of running for president again in 2024. Coming to the next article, bulk of vaccine recipients pass up second dose. So if you are following the inoculation process or inoculation drive that has been happening in the world and in India, the vaccination for coronavirus involves 2 doses. That is, if a person receives first dose, he or she has to wait for at least 4 to 12 weeks in order to receive their second dose. In India, our Prime Minister flagged up the inoculation drive for frontline workers and healthcare workers on January 16th, meaning today is January 16th and 15th. Most of the persons who received the vaccine on January 16th must take their second dose today. But in reality, only about 1 in 10 persons or about 23,628 healthcare workers got inoculated with the second dose of COVID-19 vaccine on the Saturday, that is according to Ministry of Health Ministry's data. As I said earlier, it is an important day. Saturday, that is yesterday, was a very important day for India's COVID-19 vaccination calendar because it attained the 4-week break for the second dose to be received. And on the first day of vaccination drive, that is on January 16th, 207,229 people received their first jab of coronavirus vaccine. So ideally, all of those 207,000 people should have received their second dose of vaccine, second dose of coronavirus vaccine. This is in a way a negative trend, or this has been predicted by most of the experts that people are still hesitant to get their doses of vaccine. Though the 2 lakh people who received the first dose of coronavirus vaccine on January 16th, most of them are still apprehensive of about receiving the second dose of vaccine, yet there is still a lot of vaccine hesitancy in India. Coming to the next article, Assam uses combs for voter literacy. So Assam has been struggling with voter literacy and voter turnout in the past few elections. Now the election commission, through its arm SVEEP, has been distributing everyday items with SVEEP messages. So SVEEP stands for Systematic Voters Education and Electoral Participation. So the entire theme of SVEP is greater participation for a stronger democracy. SVEP is the flagship program of Election Commission of India for voter education, spreading voter awareness and promoting voter literacy in India. SVEP is the flagship program from Election Commission of India to promote voter education and promote voter literacy in India. India, though being the biggest democracy, suffers from the highest percentage of low voter turnouts compared to other developing and other developed nations altogether. For every general elections or local elections, our voter percentage, particularly in the case of female voters, is always less compared to the global standards. This is what the Assam administration, or the areas at the districts where there is low female voter turnout, they are trying to address this situation by using SVEP messages on daily used items. Let us learn more about it. Before that, since 2009 it has been working. SVEP was started in the year 2019. The Election Commission realized that they need a special vehicle or a special flagship vehicle to improve voter education or voter literacy and improve voter turnout. So in 2009 they came out with the SVEP vehicle, and they have been working towards preparing India's electors and equipping them with basic knowledge related to electoral process. So its primary goal is to, as I said earlier, build a truly participative democracy in India by encouraging all eligible citizens to vote and make an informed decision during the elections. So they are trying their best to address the low voter turnouts and low voter illiteracy in particular northeastern states and most of the underdeveloped regions of any state, by way of messaging and positive messaging about how important their vote is and how important it is to vote in any election, not only the general election but also panchayat elections or any local body elections. So now coming back to the Assam aspect of it, the way to a prospective voter's head is through their hair. The authorities in Western Assam districts have found out. This is particular to Western Assam districts, particularly Golpara and surrounding districts, where there is lower female voter turnout in any election that has taken place in the past, and in the past few elections also. The female voter turnout percentage has been abysmally low. Now the district administration is trying to improve the female voter turnout and voter turnout in general through positive messaging. So the Golpara district administration has been distributing combs and other utilitarian items of daily use such as sanitary pads with messages printed on them. They are trying to attract or educate these female voters in these districts where there was low voter turnout recorded through their daily use items that they use daily. So the district election office is particularly ramping up the activities in area with polling stations that have recorded low overall and low female turnout in 2016 assembly and 2019 Lok Sabha elections. But at the end of the day, it is of the important essence that we have to ensure that voters use their ability to vote in any election, and particularly the voice of the female voters is being heard. That is what the positive development that SVEP is doing through northeastern states, and particularly in western districts of Assam, where voter turnout has been recorded in the past decade or so. Coming to the next article, Endless War. This editorial is in particular relation to the current developments that had taken place in the war in Yemen. Before we get into what is the current scenario and how the international community, particularly the United States, have reacted to or has been reacting to the recent developments, let us understand the genesis of the conflict in itself. So the war in Yemen, the conflict has its roots in Arab Spring of 2011. Till 2011, most of the Arab countries that were in Middle East, Egypt, South Africa, some sub-Saharan countries, most of these countries were under the rule of a dictator, or they were under military rule. Since 2011, Arab Spring came about, meaning the people of Egypt started revolting about their dictator. Simultaneously, some other dictators in the Arab countries have fell. Muhammad Gaddafi was the primary one whose people revolted against him, and he was killed by the people. And again, this Arab Spring in the 2011 gave rise to a movement in Middle East where people were asking for democracy. They were no longer about to be subjected to military dictatorship or dictators, and they were asking and they were coming out to street protesting, revolting, in most of the cases picking up weapons and fighting for democracy. So similarly, in this time period, an uprising forced the country's long-term authoritarian president Ali Abdul Saleh to hand over power to his deputy Hadi. So similarly, the same thing happened in Yemen, where a dictator named Ali Abdul Saleh was been ruling the country for a long period of time, and a similar protest or uprising started in Yemen also. So he could not control or suppress the protest or the movement that has taken place in Yemen, and he was subsequently forced to give the power to his succeeding or his deputy called Mansour Hadi. When the political transition took place, it was supposed to bring stability to Yemen, because he was very corrupt, and he brought a lot of instability into Yemen, famine and other things, because of his greediness or his inability to rule properly. When the power was transitioned to Hadi, it was the hope of the entire Yemenis people and Yemenis population, along with international community, that they are going to bring the new person is going to bring stability into Yemen. But which happens to be one of the poorest Middle East nations. But since power was transferred to Mr. Hadi, he struggled to deal with various problems, including militant attacks, corruption, food insecurity, and continuing loyalty of many military officers to Saleh. Though the power was transferred from Saleh to him, most of the military was still in support of the previous dictators. So there was a lot of infighting along with corruption. Adding to all this, the most primary aspect being the poorest nation, they couldn't feed their own population. So there was a lot of strife and grief going through the country, even though the dictator was toppled there. This was from 2011 to 2014, where this entire thing played out, where the dictator was asked to step down, protests happen, wide scale protests were taken out, rallies were taken out, and at the end of it, where international community forced the dictator Abdul Saleh to give power to his deputy. When Hadi took in the power from the dictator, he had to face a lot of problems that were of the making of his predecessor. But his own inability, Mr. Hadi's own inability, led to future problems where corruption was also rampant during his tenure also. Finally, in 2014, Houthi rebels, who are majoritarily Shia in sect, started fighting in the year 2014. This Houthi Shia Muslim rebel movement took advantage of the new president's weakness and seized control of northern Sada province and neighboring areas. Since the leader himself was in doubt and most of his military personnel were still disloyal to him, a small Shia Muslim rebel movement took place in northern states of Yemen. And these people who were named as Houthi rebels took advantage of the president's weakness and took control of northern Sada province and neighboring areas. And they were so brazen in their attacks that they went on to take capital Sana'a, forcing Mr. Hadi into exile abroad. These rebels were so ferocious with their attacks and so brutal with their attacks that they took control of the capital itself and forced the president into exile into some other country. This started in 2014, and the conflict escalated dramatically in March 2015 when Saudi Arabia and 8 most other Sunni Arab countries backed by US, UK and France began airstrikes against the Houthis. So the entire in 2015, the Saudi Arabia, its northerly neighbor, realized that what is happening in Yemen might be a problem to their own interests in Yemen and their own country. So they started bombing Houthi rebels with the backing of Western countries such as UK, US and France, stating that these Houthis are terrorists and they will be a force to reckon with if you let them go now. Let us bomb. And so they started bombing. So when Saudi Arabia sneezes, most of the other 8 countries in Arabian Peninsula will also sneeze together. So likewise, when Saudi Arabia said we are going to bomb Yemen, the 8 other countries started say okay, let us bomb Yemen from today. In 2015, bombing of civilian targets and non-civilian targets started in Yemen, which led to large-scale loss of life. According to recent United Nations number, close to 10,000 people have lost. Close to 1.3 million people have been displaced from their houses. See, these people, they not only lost their houses, they lost their ability to make a living, which led to more than 5 million children dying of hunger. So when Saudi Arabia got involved, automatically Houthis are Shia, Saudi Arabia is Sunni dominated country. When Shias are in trouble, the only country that comes to rescue is Iran. Iran and Saudi Arabia never see eye to eye because of the frictions between their own communities and their own regional politics. So Houthi rebels had the backing of Iran. Seeing that, Saudi Arabia said, if Iran is in the conflict, we are also getting involved in the conflict, and they started supporting the government. So the current scenario in Yemen is, it has become a 3-way war. How? Mr. Hadi's government is being supported by Saudi Arabia, the Houthi Shia rebel is being supported by Iran, and there is one more small fraction of rebels or small group of fighters who are fighting through the name of ITC, who are backed by Qatar. So the factions divided. Earlier the ITC was part of the Houthi rebel movement. They fractured themselves out of the Houthi rebel movement, saying that we no longer share the same ideals of Houthis, and they came out and said that we are going to start our own faction, and this ITC faction is being supported by Qatar as of now. Now the Biden administration made a decision to end the US support for Saudi Arabia's Yemen war in a way of signaling Riyadh, that is Saudi Arabia, that Trump era open support it has enjoyed is a matter of past. Now the Biden administration realized what has been going in Yemen is of no consequence to anybody, and it is only going to cause large scale catastrophe and large loss of life. Now they said that we are no longer going to support Saudi Arabia's efforts in Yemen. See, United States support Saudi by way of 2 things. One is they sell arms and ammunitions to the Saudis. The second way of supporting Saudis in Yemen war was Saudi fighter jets who were bombing Houthi positions used to refuel their fighter jets by using United States military refueling tanks. So US was supporting Saudi Arabia in two ways. One was they were supporting by selling arms and ammunitions, and the second way was supporting through logistics, meaning the fighter jets of Saudi Arabia's Air Force were refueling their jets using American fuel tanks. So now US said that no, we are not going to logistically support you in the Yemen war. But they said, but coming to the aspect of arms and ammunition, there is no word on it. But as of now, US has stopped the logistic support to Saudi Arabia in Yemen war. The Biden administration decision to end US support to Saudi Arabia's Yemen war is a signal, as I said earlier, to Saudi Arabia that it no longer enjoys the open support that it has experienced in Trump and Obama's administration. The US offered support to Saudi Arabia's campaign against the Houthi rebels in Yemen when Barack Obama was president. The decision was not Trump to support the Houthi Saudi Arabia in Yemen. The decision was taken when Mr. Barack Obama was president. It happens to be that Donald Trump continued the policy overlooking the disastrous effect of war that has turned Yemen, one of the poorest Arab countries, into a humanitarian catastrophe. So, Mr. Biden has now taken a different line, initiating steps to remove the Houthis from the terror list among the countries. The last day before Trump was supposed to be moved out from the office, his foreign secretary of state placed the Houthis in a terror watch list. Mr. Biden has taken out the Houthi rebels from the terror list so that they can come to the negotiation table to come out with a peace plan. So after 5 years of fighting, the United Arab Emirates also pulled out of the war last year. UAE also pulled out of their ITC backing rebel from the war last year, seeing that there is going to be a change of presidency in United States. While these multiple factions, that is the three factions, continued to fight, more than 10,000 people were killed in the attacks and tens of thousands more died of preventable diseases, all while Yemen stares at a famine. At the end of the day, it is a lose-lose war for everyone. For the end of its position in Yemen, Saudi Arabia has failed to oust the Houthis from Sana'a and is now facing frequent rocket and drone attacks by the rebels. They share a border, and the rebels are using the border effectively by launching drone attacks on assets of Saudi Arabia. Yemen's internationally recognized government practically lacks any power and legitimacy at home, as the war is being fought by other players. As I said, it has turned into a proxy war between Saudi Arabia and Iran. Whatever happens in the Yemen region is no longer of the consequences for the Yemen government or the rebels. It is in the hands of foreign players. Ending the war is in the best interest of all parties, and by the looks of it, the Biden administration is very much interested to end this war and put an end to the wide-scale humanitarian crisis that is brewing in Yemen as of now. Coming to the next article, fossils of Dickinsonia found at Bhimbetka. So, researchers have discovered 3 fossils of the earliest known living animal, that is 550 million year old Dickinsonia, on the roof of Bhimbetka rock shelters that are situated 40 kilometers from the Bhopal city. So, the new discoveries were published in Gondwana Research, an article or a journal of good repute, and can be seen at the beginning of the auditorium cave in the Bhimbetka rock shelter area. If you don't know, the Bhimbetka caves are an UNESCO heritage site located about 3.5 meters above the ground. So now the scientists who were coming out with their research said that this is further proof of the similar paleo environments and confirms assembly of Gondwana land by the 550 mega annum. And this is in truth to say that life has been existing here long before. The important aspect for us here is two. One is the Dickinsonia fossils being found at Bhimbetka. Coming to the next article, Farm Income Mission of Target. So, in the last year of its mission to double farmers' income, the center has admitted that no actual assessment of farm income has been carried out since 2013. So, since the project has the mission to double the farmers' income has started, the government has failed to keep any or keep track of development of farmers' income. Now they have admitted that we haven't been able to track how farmers' income have whether been doubled or not. There is no data to track farmers' income since the mission has started. Ashok Dalwai, who heads the committee on doubling farmers' income, told that only the implementation strategies were being monitored rather than the actual outcomes. The committee's head himself has come out and said that we were only monitoring the strategies, but we never monitored the outcomes of these strategies. He also said that the pandemic could have a dampening effect on reaching the income target. So this is in response to a state-wise, year-wise income data and the annual growth percentage required to achieve the 2022 targets. The ministry responded that the National Sample Survey Office last year survey on agriculture household was conducted in 2013. Whatever the data that has been used to at least come out with a positive note or at least see the difference in farmers' income since the mission has been initiated, they haven't taken out any new surveys, and the data that they are basing their predictions on was from the NSSO agricultural survey that was conducted in the year 2013. And the ministry's only the committee's only methodology for assessing income is the NSSO surveys. The only data paradigm that data set that they have been considering is the NSSO data, and they themselves haven't conducted any other data surveys or any other methodologies to study or observe either increase or decrease in the farmers' income and whether these strategies that they have adopted had any positive impact or not. The committee said that 7 strategies have been identified, such as improvement in crop and livestock productivity, savings in production costs through efficient use of resources, higher cropping intensity and diversification towards high value crops, better price realization, and a shift to non-farm jobs. They said that we have strategies, but we have no data to back our strategies or back or say that whether the farmers' income have really been doubled or not by using this or by implementing these strategies. As I said earlier, there is no direct data to show the improvement in farmers' income, which puts the entire mission into a question mark in itself, because if you're not observing or keeping track of how the strategies are working out, then what is the point of having the entire committee to oversee the mission itself? Thank you. Have a good day.